David walked back into his house with the cold wind slipping through the door, only to see his daughter Anna secretly leaving food in front of an abandoned house every night. No one knew what was inside, but the girl trembled as she whispered, "They need it more than we do." When he bent down to pick up the bowl, David found a hastily scribbled note, "Help us." Who was hiding in the dark? Why would a child know more than the grown-ups? And David, a battle-scarred soldier, was about to confront the secret the whole town had tried to bury. The evening was closing in, the last bit of sunlight fading into a dull grey sky, leaving the town wrapped in an uneasy silence. David pulled his old pickup truck up in front of the house he had left so many years ago. The porch roof was peeling, worn down by time, and he stood there on the side of the road, back straight but eyes heavy, like a man just coming home from war instead of simply returning to a familiar street. Slung over his shoulder was that old soldier's backpack, faded and frayed, weighing him down the way the years had. Inside, the house was dark. The bulb over the porch had burned out long ago, leaving only a faint yellow glow flickering from somewhere deeper in the hall. The air smelled damp, with the bite of rotting wood and old dust. David pushed the door open, and the hinge let out a high-pitched squeal that cut straight through his chest, the way an old scar can flare up without warning. The home that once held warmth now felt like an empty shell, cold and unfamiliar. He drew in a slow breath and softly called out his daughter's name. "Anna?" His voice echoed through the empty rooms, bouncing back at him like the voice of a stranger. No answer. Only the ticking of the wall clock, slow and steady, like the tired heart of someone who's run too long. David stepped carefully out onto the back porch. From there he saw Anna at the far end of the yard, her small figure bent over, clutching a brown paper bag to her chest. She moved quietly toward the narrow alley beside the house. The lengthening shadows stretched across her path, making her look both fragile and secretive. He didn't call to her. Instead, he followed, keeping his distance. His boots ground into the gravel, each crunch echoing in the quiet. The wind swept past, carrying the rust of the fence line and the damp of the wet ground. His fist tightened at his side. His heart hammered with the same tension he had known in uniform, that edge of something feeling when you knew trouble was close, but couldn't yet see it. Anna stopped in front of an abandoned house. Its door was scarred, paint stripped off in wide patches, the boarded windows creaking under the touch of the wind. She placed the brown bag down on the steps and crouched a little, as though listening to whatever might be inside. David held his breath, watching from the shadows. A cold unease slipped beneath his skin. He could see his daughter's lips moving, whispering something too faint to catch, and then she turned quickly, her small shoulders trembling as she walked away. He wanted to rush forward, grab her by the shoulders, and demand she tell him what was going on. But his legs wouldn't move. Something unseen pinned him in place. A vague, gnawing fear pressed down on him, the sense that if he opened that rotting door, he would come face to face with something he never wanted to know. The heart of a soldier who had survived war clenched inside him, not at the sound of bombs or gunfire, but at the quiet dread that had rooted itself in his own backyard. Anna had already walked back toward the porch, her eyes fixed on the ground as if she didn't dare meet his gaze. David remained in the dark, still and unsettled, chilled by a certainty he couldn't shake. Behind that ruined door, something waited, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he had to face it. David stepped inside, his boots hitting the old wooden floor with a heavy thud that seemed to echo back at him. Anna was already sitting at the table, her hands folded in her lap, eyes cast down as if trying to avoid her father's gaze. On the table there was only half a loaf of stale bread, a half-empty pitcher of water, and the dim yellow light stretching long shadows across the cracked wall. He sat across from her, pulling off his worn soldier's gloves, his calloused hands locking together. His voice came low, rough around the edges, and shaking with something he didn't yet understand. "What were you doing out there?" No answer, just the steady ticking of the clock. He asked again, slower this time, trying to hold on to his patience. "Anna, I saw you take that paper bag to the old house. Who's in there?" The girl lifted her head, her eyes bright but clouded with worry. For a moment, David caught his own reflection in them, resolve tangled with fear. Then Anna whispered, so soft it was almost air, "They need it more than we do." Her words dropped into the silence heavier than any wind outside. David froze, unable to respond right away. His throat tightened, and old memories pushed through nights on the front lines handing out rations, watching children fight over dry crackers. But that was war, far away, not here, not in this quiet town, not on his own doorstep. He forced his voice to steady. "Who are they?" But Anna pressed her lips together, her small hands gripping at her shirt, eyes fixed on the floor. Her silence felt like a wall David couldn't break through. He sat there, listening to the wind hissing through the cracks in the doorframe, and beneath it, a faint rustling sound drifting over from the abandoned house across the alley. It was the kind of sound that carried secrets, like whispers buried in the dark. A weight settled in his chest, not the kind of fear he'd known in combat, but something quieter, harder to name. In that silence, he didn't feel like the battle-tested soldier anymore. He felt like a father lost in his own hometown, shut out from the truth his little girl was carrying. He wanted to pull Anna close, shake the answers out of her, but the shimmer of tears in her eyes stopped him. There was something bigger here, something looming over the fragile lives they were trying to hold together, a shadow that no raised voice could ever scatter. He stood and walked out onto the porch. The night sky hung heavy, the moon buried behind thick clouds. The abandoned house across the alley sat quiet, but it carried the presence of something watching. David braced a hand on the railing, his eyes locked on that old wooden door. The darkness wasn't just a house anymore. It was a threshold to a truth he wasn't ready to meet. Behind him, Anna's voice broke the stillness, trembling. "Dad, don't go over there, please." David turned back, the yellow light from inside blurring her face, and he saw that her fear was deeper than he had guessed. But before he could answer, from the abandoned house came a sudden sound, a dull thump, like something heavy hitting the floor. Night fell slow, a thin layer of fog stretching itself across the town. David pulled on his heavy coat and stepped off the porch, knowing he couldn't just sit there any longer. Inside his chest was a restless thrum, part of it like the old days waiting for a signal in the trench, part of it like the helplessness of a father who can't read his own daughter's silence. The alley was black, the only light a lonely street lamp throwing a long shadow. He kept close to the stone wall, watching the abandoned house from a distance. It stood quiet, but from a cracked window frame there was the faintest flicker, weak and nervous, like a dying eye that refused to close. David held his breath and edged closer, careful not to crunch the broken bricks underfoot. He leaned near the warped door and peered through a gap in the boards. Inside, a figure moved, a woman, thin and frail, her hair hanging down across her face. She stooped to pick up an empty bowl from the floor and set it aside. Every motion was slow, drained of strength. David felt a shiver run through him. In a flash he saw again the places he'd tried to forget, war-torn villages, women and children gaunt and starving, trembling hands reaching out for crumbs. But this wasn't some far-off country. This was his own hometown, the street where he'd grown up. That sight didn't belong here. A sound behind him snapped his thoughts. He turned, and headlights cut through the fog at the mouth of the alley. A sleek car rolled to a stop. The door opened, and Victor Hale stepped out. Dark suit, neat tie, his movements steady, carrying that kind of cold confidence you only see in men who believe everything belongs to them. His leather shoes cracked the gravel, sharp and deliberate. David eased back into the shadows, forcing his breath to stay low. For one moment their eyes nearly met, but Victor didn't seem to notice. He only curved his lips into the faintest smirk, like a man amused by his own secrets. Victor walked up toward the old house, pausing just a few feet from the door. He pulled out his phone, dialed quick, and David caught fragments of words through the fog. "Keep quiet, tonight." Then he turned, climbed back into the car, and the engine growled to life. The exhaust cloud hung heavy in the alley, choking the air. David stood frozen, his heart racing. There was a coldness spreading through him, like Victor had just squeezed the very breath out of the town. He turned back to the house. The woman was gone from the crack in the wood. The door shifted just slightly, as though it had been bolted shut. David stepped away, torn in half. Part of him wanted to storm inside, drag the truth out into the open. The other part, just as fierce, whispered that this wasn't simple, that something darker than he could name was already winding itself around Anna, and around him too. The wind picked up, rattling the rusted fence. David started to turn back toward home. And then it came a cry, sharp and muffled, the sound of a child sobbing through the walls of the abandoned house, echoing into the night. The next morning the town was still, as if nothing had happened. David drove his old pickup to the sheriff's office. On the wall outside, a faded American flag flapped in the wind, the pole groaning each time a gust pushed through. Inside, the air smelled of weak coffee and old paper, heavy with the kind of stale neglect that made a man want to leave as soon as he walked in. Sheriff Cole sat behind his desk, belly straining against a wrinkled shirt, eyes buried in a thick stack of files. He didn't even look up when David stepped through the door. David stood tall, his voice rough but steady. "I need to ask about the abandoned house at the end of Maple. Someone's in there. Last night I heard a child." His words fell into the room like stones, and for a moment there was no response. Sheriff Cole finally lifted his cup, sipped slow, and set it back down before meeting his eyes. The sheriff's stare was steel, empty of surprise. "David, you just got back. Best thing for you is rest. Take care of your girl. Don't let your mind wander to things that aren't there. David's fists clenched. I know what I saw. Someone's hiding there. They're not okay. Anna knows it too. I can't pretend it's nothing. Sheriff Cole gave a dry chuckle, the sound thin and tired, like a man who'd heard the same problem too many times. He leaned back in his chair, tapped his fingers against the desk in a slow rhythm. You think you saw something, but this town hasn't changed. Those old houses are empty. Sometimes it's the wind, sometimes stray cats. You've been gone a long time. Memory plays tricks. Don't go digging up what's better left alone. Those last words, don't go digging up the past, hit David hard, cold as the clang of a cell door shutting. He'd heard that tone before, on the battlefield, an officer brushing off the truth with a short command meant to shut mouths. But this wasn't the army. This was his home, and his daughter was tied to it. He tried to choke back the anger, but his voice cracked as it came out. If you won't do anything, I'll find out myself. The sheriff didn't answer right away. He rose slowly, walked around the desk, and stopped close enough for David to smell the stale smoke on his breath. I'll say this once more, he murmured. You just got back. Don't stir up trouble. This town doesn't have room for men who want to play hero. Worry about your roof that's ready to fall in, and that girl of yours. That's enough. David held his stare, searching for some trace of decency, but there was nothing. Only the hardened glaze of a man who'd long since chosen the side of power. David turned, pushed out the door, the slam echoing behind him. On the porch, the wind cut sharp against his collar, and the whole town felt like it was swallowing the truth. He climbed back into his truck, his hands trembling on the wheel. Cole's warning circled through his head, but it brought him no calm. If anything, it confirmed what he already knew: something was hidden in that rotting house, and the sheriff's stone wall only proved it wasn't simple. When he turned the key, the mirror caught it. A black sedan parked at the end of the street, engine running, no one stepping out. Night fell heavy, the town swallowed up by fog so thick the streetlights flickered like the last breath of a candle. David couldn't sleep. Sheriff Cole's warning still rang in his head, but it was the man's cold silence that gnawed at him most. He pulled on his old army coat, tugged the brim of his cap low, and slipped outside. The air cut sharp against his skin. The alley that led to the abandoned house stretched out in front of him like a dead end. When he reached it, the broken wood scattered across the ground cast jagged shadows in the weak moonlight. The door hung loose, its boards creaking with every gust of wind. David moved slow, each step heavy, his eyes combing every detail. On the porch he saw a cracked ceramic bowl overturned, crumbs of bread scattered beside it, left over from the bag Anna had carried. He knelt down and turned the bowl. Underneath, pressed flat, was a scrap of paper, damp and wrinkled, stained with a watermark. His hand shook as he opened it. The pencil marks were rough, hurried. Help us. Just 3 words, but they squeezed his chest tight. No longer shadows, no longer tricks of the night. This was a real cry. He clutched the note, breath ragged, memories crashing back, villagers slipping notes into the hands of American soldiers, words scribbled quick, begging for survival in war zones. And now, here at home, he held the same plea in his own hand. He glanced around. Everything was still, but the air was different. Heavier, pressing down on him like unseen eyes watching from the dark. He stepped closer to the door, listening. Nothing inside but the damp smell of rot and dust spilling out. His palm rested against the wood, torn between charging in and dragging the truth into the open, or heeding the cold voice in his gut that told him if he walked in tonight, he might not walk back out the same. He stepped back, slipped the note into his coat pocket, and clenched his fist around it. The wind cut through the trees, his shadow stretching long and crooked across the gravel road. Turning away, David knew the line had been crossed. He could never pretend again, never unsee, never unhear. That trembling scrawl had dragged him into a new fight, one without maps, without orders, without a uniform. Just as he stepped out of the alley, headlights blazed straight into his face. The black sedan was there, waiting. Its engine roared, and the driver's window slid down. In the dim glow, David caught the thin smile of Victor Hale, staring right at him. The house still felt thick with night, as if the dark had refused to leave with the dawn. David sat at the kitchen table, the scrap of paper with those 3 words, "Help us," spread out in front of him. The dim light above cast down across the crooked pencil lines, each letter cutting into him like a blade. He'd lived through nights on the front lines that pushed men to the edge, but rarely had his heart felt this heavy. The bedroom door creaked open. Anna stepped out, her hair a tangle, her bare feet pressing against the cold wooden floor. She tried to slip past, but David called her back, his voice low and steady. "Anna, come here." She stopped, hesitant, then shuffled toward the chair across from him. David slid the note across the table, his eyes locked on her small face. "You know where this came from, don't you?" Anna bit her lip, her eyes red, and then the tears broke. They streamed down as she choked out the words. "What if they starve, Dad? I couldn't watch them die right there in front of us." Her voice was small, but it hit him like a hammer, tightening his chest. He had held steady under shell fire, but his daughter's tears stripped him of all defenses. He reached across the table, his rough hand resting on her trembling shoulder. "How long have you been doing this?" She buried her face against his chest, her words muffled and shaky. "Weeks. I've been sneaking food when you were asleep. I heard the crying in that house. I know they're afraid." David closed his eyes, the weight inside him crushing. Every part of his mind screamed that this was danger, that she should never have been anywhere near it. But her compassion, raw and unguarded, reminded him of what the army drilled into him long ago. Never leave anyone behind. He stroked her tangled hair, forcing calm into his tone. "You shouldn't be carrying this alone. From now on, I'll handle it." But Anna shook her head, tears still streaking her cheeks. "You won't do anything. You're just as afraid as the others. I see it. I see they have no one but me." David felt those words tear him open. She wasn't wrong. He had hesitated, let the cold silence of this town make him doubt. And now her trembling eyes left him no choice. The silence between them grew heavy. David closed his fist around the note, his voice rough but firm. "I promise you, I won't turn away. But you can't go there alone again. Do you understand?" Anna nodded faintly, her eyes wet but softening with relief. Outside, a heavy truck rolled down the empty street, the sound rumbling like distant thunder. David stared through the window, thoughts colliding. This wasn't just Anna's burden anymore. It was his. He was a soldier who'd come home looking for peace, and that peace had already been shattered. He rose, stepped out onto the porch. The cold air bit against his skin, but he didn't flinch. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. In the half-light, he tightened his grip on the note, and then he saw it from the alley leading to the abandoned house. A flashlight beam flickered once, then vanished, as if someone was out there watching his home. That night, David walked into the only bar in town. The place stank of cheap beer, smoke, and the pounding rattle of an old jukebox. He just wanted a quiet corner, maybe one glass to settle the weight in his chest. But this town didn't give him that. Eyes followed as soon as he stepped inside, eyes that knew Victor Hale more than they cared to remember the service of a soldier. David went straight to the counter, gave the bartender a nod, and ordered a whiskey. He hadn't even lifted the glass when Victor appeared. Black suit, shoes polished to a shine, walking slow like he owned every board of that floor. He didn't sit. He planted himself in the middle of the room, that half-smile carved into his face. "Well, look here," Victor said loud enough for everyone to hear. "The soldier who walked away has come back." A few laughs sputtered from the corner, men who owed their livelihoods to Victor's handouts. David's grip tightened around the glass, his eyes never leaving the man in front of him. Victor stepped closer, voice dropping but still carrying across the room. "You left this town, left your girl, and now you come back like nothing happened. That's a soldier for you, good at leaving." The words cut deep. David thought of Anna, of her tear-filled eyes when she whispered, "What if they starve, Dad?" He knew Victor was trying to break him, turn him into a joke in front of these people. But inside that sting, a small fire caught flame. David rose, tall frame casting a shadow across the table. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at Victor, cold and steady as steel. The bar hushed, nothing but the hiss of the jukebox in the back. The bartender edged away, a couple of patrons turning their faces like they hadn't heard a thing. Victor didn't flinch. That smirk stayed, like David was just another piece in the game he played. David set the glass down slow, his voice low but clear. "You can laugh at me, but you leave my daughter out of it." His words weren't shaky anymore. They were a warning. For the first time, Victor hesitated, then broke into loud laughter, filling the bar with it. "Your daughter?" he said, eyes gleaming with mockery. "She's learning how to live in this town better than you ever did. She might even know more than you." The words twisted in David's gut. What was he hinting at? Anna's trips to that house? The note he'd found? No one could be sure. But the way Victor said it, with that drag in his tone, made it clear David and Anna were no longer moving unseen. They were being watched. David stepped toward the door, slow, not wanting to turn the bar into a battleground. His hand touched the handle, then a chuckle rose from the far table. A man laid down a crumpled scrap of paper on the wood. David froze. He knew it instantly. The note. "Help us." The one he thought he had hidden inside his coat. That night, David couldn't sit still any longer. The image of that note in the bar, the one he thought he had hidden, cut through his head like a blade. Someone had been watching him, close enough to reach into his coat without him ever knowing. In a war zone, that would have meant he was already dead. But this was supposed to be home. The truth only drove one thing deeper into him. There was no turning back now. He pulled on his coat, ignored the howl of the wind across the porch, and headed straight for the abandoned house at the end of Maple. The old wooden door was barely shut, darkness swallowing the frame whole. He scanned the street, saw nothing, then drew in a breath and threw his shoulder into the door. It cracked open with a sharp snap. The smell hit him, first damp wood, dust, and the sour stench of people living too long in hiding. He raised his flashlight, swept it across the room. The beam caught faces, 3 of them, 2 women and a young man, huddled together in the corner. Their eyes darted, hands lifting as if to shield themselves from a captor. David froze, his heart tightening. This wasn't imagination, not stray animals. Flesh and bone, worn thin, eyes hollowed, skin stretched tight over bone. One woman held a child close, the little one asleep but breathing heavy, labored. David lowered the light, voice rasping. "You don't have to be afraid. I just want to know who left the note." The young man met his gaze, eyes desperate, and whispered in broken English, "We need help. It's Owen." For a moment, David was back overseas, seeing the same faces, families stripped of everything, still clawing at life. He swallowed hard and stepped closer, showing open hands to prove he carried no weapon. The woman clutching her child broke into sobs, the sound filling the empty room, echoing like a prayer. David's chest ached with helplessness. This wasn't Anna's secret pity anymore. This was raw reality, sitting in front of him. He crouched, kept his voice low. "Does anyone know you're here? Why this place?" The young man shook his head, lips trembling. "Nowhere else. If caught, we lose all." David understood. This town had no room for outsiders. And Victor, smiling, powerful, surely knew more than anyone. David's eyes moved back to the door, and the weight of it all pressed down. There was no ignoring this now. Leaving them meant siding with it. Helping them meant dragging himself and Anna into danger. But looking at the child in the woman's arms, chest rising weak, David knew the answer had already been made. His voice came out firm. "I'll find a way. But you stay quiet. No one can know I was here tonight." 3 pairs of eyes clung to him, gratitude tangled with fear, like they were holding onto his promise as if it was rope. David stood, ready to step back out, when the crunch came, heavy boots grinding on gravel outside, each step deliberate, closing in on the door. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, then came the pounding hard, heavy, like a hammer against wood. David stiffened, glancing back at the 3 figures huddled in the corner. The baby jerked awake, screaming. He motioned for silence and planted himself in the middle of the room. The door flew open. A flashlight beam hit him straight in the eyes. Sheriff Cole stepped in, 2 deputies behind him, pistols hanging at their hips. Cole's eyes swept the room, cold as stone, then locked on David. "Step aside, David," Cole said, flat and firm, like he was calling a routine. "This isn't yours to handle." David didn't move, his frame blocking almost the entire corner where the migrants shrank into the shadows. Sweat rolled down his temple, but his eyes stayed fixed on the sheriff. "No. You know they're not hurting anyone. They're just trying to stay alive." Cole gave a dry laugh, a shrug. "This town has laws. I didn't write them, but I'm bound to them. And you just got back. Best not to stir trouble before you've even found your footing." The 2 deputies moved forward, trying to edge around him. David raised an arm, stopping them, his voice rough. "If you want in, you go through me." The air tightened. All that remained was the sharp breath of those behind him and the weak crying of the baby. In that moment, David knew he wasn't just a father protecting his daughter anymore. He was a veteran standing toe-to-toe with an enemy on American soil. Only this time, the enemy wore badges and carried the town's authority. Cole studied him, calculating. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice so only David could hear. "How long do you think you can hold this off? Victor already knows. Once he knows, no one saves them. Not you, not even your girl." The words hit like stones dropping into storm water. David clenched his jaw, swallowed the bitter taste of helplessness. The sheriff wasn't wrong. Victor's hand was everywhere. But stepping aside meant leaving Anna, leaving these fragile lives, to be crushed. David stood silent for a breath, then shifted forward, covering the corner completely. His voice cracked but carried steel. "If you're taking someone, take me. They stay." Cole arched a brow, a hint of surprise, then smirked. "You think you're worth a damn? You're just a washed-up soldier. No one's trading for you." He jerked his head at his men. That's when the noise came fast. Heavy boots rushing down the alley. More than 2, more than 3. Windows shattered, light pouring in, and David saw it. Not just deputies, but a pack of rough men storming in, carrying clubs and rope. The door of that abandoned house blew open under the pounding fists, shouts, and sweeping flashlights. David didn't have a second to think. He spun around, signaled the 3 migrants to fall back, then threw his shoulder into an old shelf, toppling it across the entrance. Sheriff Cole barked orders. Strange men rushed in alongside his deputies, boots hammering like they'd tear the rotten walls apart. David grabbed the back door, yanked it open, and pushed everyone out into the storm. Rain came down hard, drumming on their heads, drowning footsteps and voices. The field stretched wide and dark, slick with mud. David supported the woman carrying her child, while the young man pulled the other woman forward. Rain whipped across their faces, wind cut sharp, but no one slowed down. Shouts chased them from behind, flashlights slicing the dark like hunters' eyes. David clenched his teeth, muscles burning, but his boots kept driving through the muck, pulling them all forward. At the far edge of the field, a small figure appeared. Anna. She must have followed him all along, now shivering in the storm, eyes wide with fear. "Dad!" she cried, her voice thin against the wind. David caught her hand, felt how icy and trembling it was. "Hold tight. Don't let go." Anna nodded, rain mixing with tears on her young face. The group staggered across patches of uneven ground. Every step brought David back to the weight of war, carrying wounded men, leading civilians through fire. Only this time it was his daughter, and strangers who had no one else. He knew there was no turning back, no handing them over to a town twisted by Victor's grip. In the storm it was clear, he had crossed the line. He was no longer part of the town's rules, he was standing against them. Sirens wailed in the distance, red and blue bleeding through the rain-soaked sky. Cole had called for more. David pulled the group down into a shallow ditch, using his body to shield them as they crept along the bank. Rainwater filled it quick, mud clinging to their boots, but it also erased their tracks. Anna clung to his arm, her breath ragged, but in her eyes shone a kind of fierce resolve he hadn't seen before. They scrambled up the last slope and tumbled into a hollow. David lifted his head, rain stinging his eyes, and through the downpour he saw them rows of police cruisers blocking the way ahead. Headlights bore down, pinning him and Anna in white glare. Sheriff Cole's voice cut through the storm, cold as iron. "David, don't be a fool. Hand them over, and maybe you keep your girl." The days that followed turned the whole town sour. Rumors spread quicker than any wind whipping through those narrow streets. Folks whispered at the diner over weak coffee, on the church steps after service, and in the grocery store lot where the dust never settled, and every whisper told the same tale. David Miller had come back from the war not with honor, but with trouble strapped to his back. They said he was hiding agitators, turning his house into a shelter for people who didn't belong. David knew that kind of talk didn't just appear. It carried the fingerprints of Victor Hale. Everywhere he walked, eyes slid away or backs turned cold. Old acquaintances kept their mouths shut. Even the grocery that once let him run a tab slammed the book closed in his face, the owner muttering about new rules while staring off at the wall. The weight in David's chest grew heavy, anger like a stone pressing down. He didn't mind contempt, he'd carried plenty in uniform. But when he stood outside Anna's schoolyard and watched children peel away from her, leaving his girl alone under their stares, the blood in his veins burned. That night at dinner, Anna didn't touch her food. She sat small, shoulders hunched, eyes lowered. "Dad," she whispered, "they told me I shouldn't play with the others anymore. They said you're a bad man." The chopstick slipped from David's fingers, clattering against the table. Words caught in his throat. He wanted to lie, to tell her it would pass, but her eyes left no room for false comfort. He reached across, held her tiny hand in his scarred palm, and felt his chest tighten. "Listen to me. Let them talk. We know the truth, and I won't let anyone take that from us." The words weren't just for Anna, they were carved into his own heart. Silence and patience had no place here. If he stood idle, they'd grind him and his daughter down, piece by piece. He rose, stared through the window into the heavy dark. In that blank space, he saw Victor's crooked smile again, sharp as a blade, sliding straight into his pride. The next day, David walked into the bar. The air was thick with stale beer and cheap laughter. Heads turned, eyes fixed on him as if he were a stranger in his own town. Victor sat at the center table, a few loyal men spread around him like dogs at his feet. He lifted a glass, smiling like he'd been waiting. David didn't waver. He walked straight ahead, boots slow, steady. The room hushed, the jukebox rattling faint in the background. He stopped in front of Victor, his voice low, steady as iron. "You've been spreading lies about me and my daughter. You touch Anna again, and I swear I won't let it slide." Victor tilted his head, eyes glinting with amusement. He lowered his glass, voice soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough for everyone to hear. Then let's see how you stand against this whole town, Soldier Miller. Before David could answer, the bar's door swung open. A man stepped in, holding a stack of fresh flyers, raising one high for all to see. Printed bold across it was the picture of David's home, with a line in red screaming out, "Harboring criminals, a danger to the community." Morning came grey, and David pulled the old pickup to the curb outside the school. The paint on the sidewalk chipped and faded. He looked at his daughter and said, "Keep your head up. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself." Anna nodded, hugging her sketchbook tight, then walked through the gate. David stayed in the truck a moment longer, watching. The other parent's eyes cut toward him, cold as stone, no attempt to hide the scorn. He turned the key and drove off, but his chest felt heavy, like he had left his little girl standing on a battlefield all alone. In class, Anna took her seat in the back row. On the paper in front of her, she drew a soldier standing in front of a flag, his arm raised as if shielding someone behind him. The lines were clumsy, but the resolve was clear. It was her way of holding on to faith in her father. Then came the sneer behind her. Victor's son, bigger than the rest of the kids, snatched the sketchbook from her hands. He flipped to the drawing, smirked, and said loud enough for all to hear, "That your dad? A deserter. A traitor." Laughter rippled across the room, a few kids eager to join in. Anna's fists clenched. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. She reached to take the book back, but the boy tore the page in half right before her face. The pieces drifted down to the floor. The soldier she had drawn, shredded into meaningless lines. Anna froze, chest heaving, tears finally rising. Her voice cracked but carried, "Don't you touch my father." The class murmured, restless, but no one stepped in. The teacher kept her back turned, chalk scratching on the board, as if humiliation was nothing more than childish noise. Word reached David by the end of the day. A parent he barely knew mentioned it with a shrug. "Maybe your girl ought to keep quiet, Miller. Keep out of trouble." David's grip on the steering wheel tightened, heat rushing into his face. In his mind, he saw Anna slumped over her desk, her drawing ripped apart. Rage welled up in him, the same kind that burned when he'd watched comrades fall while superiors stayed silent. The town wasn't just out to break him, they wanted to crush his daughter too. That afternoon he picked Anna up. She sat still in the passenger seat, eyes swollen, clutching her battered sketchbook with the torn page tucked inside. He looked at her, throat tight. "Anna, I'm sorry." She shook her head, whispered, "I'm not afraid. They can rip paper, but they can't rip you out of me." Those words lit a fire in David's chest. He knew then there was no more backing down. Night fell. He sat on the porch, the old rifle leaning by his side. Rain misted, shadows closed in. His mind was fixed on one thought. If Victor meant to drive them into a corner, he would answer not with words, but with action. As he sat still, headlights cut through the yard, flooding the house in harsh white. A black car stopped, the window rolled down, and Victor's laughter spilled into the night rain. "Get ready, Miller. This time, you won't get back up." The morning was grayer than most, the wind carrying a chill as it moved through the trees, dragging with it the smell of wet earth. David opened the front door, meaning only to take in a breath of air, but he froze in place. Lying across the chipped wooden step was the small body of a dog. Its fur was soaked, blood smeared dark across the boards, its eyes still wide and glassy. It was the pup Anna had fed scraps to, the one she'd giggled at as it chased her shadow across the yard. David crouched, his hand trembling as he reached toward it, his throat locking tight. This wasn't an accident. It was a message delivered in blood, left where he couldn't miss it. Behind him came the sound of small steps. Anna stood framed in the doorway, her eyes wide, her little hand pressed over her mouth. The book she was carrying slipped to the floor as she rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the dog, sobbing hard. Why would they do this?" she repeated, her voice broken, shredding the silence around them. David had no words. He pulled her into his arms, her tears soaking through his shirt, his own chest rigid with rage, so sharp it left him numb. He knew this was no longer a warning whispered from the shadows. This was an open strike, aimed straight at the most fragile part of his home. They didn't just want him cornered by the town, they wanted to shatter Anna's trust, to carve out whatever hope she had left. David lifted his head, eyes cold and clear through the morning fog. In his mind he saw Victor's grin, Sheriff Cole's silence. Together they had written their message in blood on his porch, and this time they meant to break him. He wrapped the small body in an old blanket and carried it to the backyard, to the spot where Anna had once played. He dug until his hands ached, until the ground swallowed the last of the blanket. Anna stood by, silent, eyes red and lips pressed tight. When the dirt was finally packed down, she whispered, "Dad, they're not going to stop. They want to take everything from us." David nodded, the weight in his chest turning solid. Then they'll pay for it. His voice came out steady, hard as steel. In that moment, helplessness gave way to resolve. He wasn't just a soldier bound by orders anymore. He was a father ready to strike back. When night fell, David sat on the porch, rifle resting across his lap. The dark was heavy, broken only by the wind's moan and the faint buzz of insects. His eyes locked on the road ahead, waiting. His heart didn't pound with fear anymore. It kept time with a slow, contained fury, ready to explode. Anna was asleep inside, but he knew even in her dreams, she still carried the sound of her own sobbing. His grip tightened on the gunstock. Then, from the distance, headlights crept along the dirt road, slowing as they reached his gate. The car stopped. A voice he knew too well rang out through a loudspeaker. "Come on out, Miller. We've got business to settle." The saloon door slammed open and the cold night wind swept in, carrying the damp weight of the dark outside. David stepped straight through, his boots hitting the old wooden floor, each strike like a warning shot across the room. Inside, Victor sat at the center table, whiskey glass in hand, flanked by a few of his usual hangers-on, faces full of smug confidence. The chatter that had filled the place went quiet as David drew closer, his eyes clouded over with raw anger. He stopped right in front of the table and locked eyes with Victor. "It was you, wasn't it?" His voice came out low and rough, heavy as stone. "My daughter's dog. Who else would have done that but you?" Victor didn't rush to answer. He sipped his drink, wiped his mouth with a handkerchief, then looked up with that thin smile. "You want to blame me? That's interesting. But this town's got plenty of folks who can't stand you, Miller. Not everyone needs me to give the order to teach you a lesson." David clenched his jaw, rage boiling over. He lunged forward, grabbing Victor by the collar and yanking him to his feet. Chairs toppled, whiskey spilled across the floor. Victor's eyes flared wide, but the grin stayed, taunting him, sharper than ever. "That's who you really are. Just a soldier who only knows violence." Murmurs rippled through the bar, a few men rising half out of their seats, but David's grip only tightened, his hands trembling from the strain of holding himself back. Then the door swung open again. Sheriff Cole came in, his voice cutting across the room like a command. "Let him go, David." David turned his head, breath ragged, Victor still in his grasp. The sheriff moved closer, face taut as stone. "Release him, or I'll see you in a cell tonight." Slowly, David unclenched his fists, shoving Victor back. The man staggered, straightening his collar with a smug calm. The whole room held its breath, no one daring to laugh or speak. David looked at Cole, his voice choked but sharp with defiance. "You know he's behind all of it, and you still choose to shield him." The sheriff didn't blink. His hand rested on the gun at his side. "You're standing on a line, Miller. One more step, and you're just another troublemaker, and you know exactly what that means." The fury still burned in David, but he swallowed it down, backing away one step at a time. Not because he feared them, but because he knew Anna was waiting at home, and he couldn't leave her to wake up alone in an empty house. Victor dropped back into his chair, lifting a fresh glass of whiskey, his voice light, mocking, as if nothing had just happened. "You see, Miller, you can't win. This town isn't yours anymore." David turned on his heel and walked out, the rain slamming into his face, cold but powerless to cool the fire burning inside him. He knew he'd just sidestepped a trap, but he also knew the fight was far from over. And as he set foot on the saloon steps, headlights snapped on, cutting through the downpour, aimed square at his chest. From inside the black car came the unmistakable sound of a round being chambered. The rain hadn't let up by the time David made it back to the house. The porch light spilled a tired glow across his face, showing every shadow etched deep into him. Anna was asleep inside, her breathing steady, but he sat out there in the dark on the old wooden chair, the battered gun lying close at hand. The whole town had already shut its doors on him. Neighbors turned their backs, the law bent to one man's will, and Victor stood over his shoulder like a ghost, reminding him he had nowhere left to lean. In that heavy silence, a knock came at the door, light but sharp. David rose, his hand brushing the gun, and cracked it open. Standing in the rain was Ruth Carter, the old woman from the far end of the street. Her face was carved with years, her thin raincoat smeared with mud, her eyes fixed on him with a mix of caution and urgency. "I don't have much time," she whispered, voice shaking but steady. "We need to talk." David let her in, poured the last of the cold tea, and watched as she clasped her frail hands tight before speaking. "I know you're hiding those people, and I know Victor won't stop until he gets them, or gets you." David's jaw tightened, but she pressed on. Years back, when the border was still locked down, there was an old tunnel. It ran from an abandoned warehouse outside town straight into the southern woods. Folks used it to slip across before the authorities claimed they closed it up. But I lived long enough to know it was never fully buried. If you want to save them, that's the only way. His heart kicked hard in his chest. Her words hit him like a spark to dry kindling. He still burned with rage, still felt the blood rise every time Victor's name crossed his mind. But now there was something else in his hands, a chance, a way out. His fists clenched as he remembered those hollow faces huddled in the moldy house, the baby's labored cry, and Anna's voice asking, if they starve, what then? For once, he could do more than stand guard at a door. David looked at Ruth, his voice low but firm. You sure that tunnel's still passable? She nodded, her eyes lit with a strange kind of fire. It's dangerous, rotten, might cave in on you, but it's better than letting them die in Victor's grip. Right then, he knew his choice. There was no room left for waiting, no time for hoping justice would crawl its way here on its own. He turned toward the window. Rain hammered the porch roof, sharp and steady. In the flicker of light, he thought he saw a car sitting out in the lane, headlights gone dark, Victor, or his men, keeping watch. They hadn't let go of him, not for a second. But this time, David wasn't going to play by their script. He faced Ruth again, his voice hard as steel. Tomorrow, I take them out. One way or another it gets done. Ruth nodded, breathing out like she'd just set down a heavy weight. She rose to leave, but before her hand touched the door, an engine roared outside. Headlights blazed through the window, and David caught sight of figures moving in the rain, each one carrying the cold gleam of a gun. The night smothered the town like a thick black curtain. Inside the still house, David spread a rough map across the table, his calloused finger tracing a line from the abandoned warehouse out to the southern woods. Anna sat beside him, her eyes wide and tense, her small hand clenching the fabric of his shirt sleeve. Dad, are we sure we'll make it out? She asked, her voice trembling like a candle in the wind. David looked at her, his hard features softening for just a moment. He placed his big hand gently over hers. We're not sure, but this is the only chance we've got, and I need you stronger than you've ever been. Anna swallowed, her lips quivering, but there was a flicker of fire in her eyes, a spark of determination that no child should carry, yet she did. By the time the clock slid toward midnight, the group was ready. 4 souls on the run, David, Anna, and the 3 frightened immigrants huddled close together. The rain had eased to a mist, but the ground was slick with mud, the night air cold enough to bite into bone. David walked up front, the old pistol pressed against his hip, Anna trailing close behind him. Each step hammered his chest like a drumbeat. They hugged the shadows of narrow lanes, slipping past the faint glow of porch lights, every breath heavy, every sound too loud. When they reached the warehouse, David shoved the rotten wooden door open, its groan echoing through the silence. Dust swirled in beams of pale moonlight, spilling through the broken boards, cutting the darkness into sharp silver slashes. Ruth had been right. In the far corner, beneath a broken plank, a hole yawned open. Damp air spilled out, cool and sour, carrying the smell of stone and forgotten earth. David lowered his flashlight into the pit. Its beam struck damp brick walls, streaked with moss, a narrow passage that seemed to stretch on forever. Go, he muttered, voice low but steady. He helped the woman with the baby descend first, her arms shaking as she clutched the little one close. The young man followed, coaxing the second woman down. Anna slipped in after, her small frame vanishing into the dark, and David went last, sealing the entrance behind them. The tunnel swallowed them whole. Their footsteps echoed, mixing with the steady drip of water falling from unseen cracks overhead. The sound filled the narrow corridor, turning silence into something tighter, harsher. David's light cut through the black, showing walls wet with decay, their breath fogging in the chill. He had seen caves before, bunkers in war, places where men whispered their last prayers. This felt like that, a place where the living carried the weight of the dead. Then his gut twisted. Something was wrong. The air carried more than damp and stone. It carried heat, a trace of breath that didn't belong to them. He froze, raised his fist for the others to stop. His heart slammed hard in his chest. For a moment, the tunnel was silent, except for the drip, drip, drip from above. Then, from the far end, a light flared bright, cutting the dark in two. The click of metal echoed sharp, a hammer pulled back on a gun. And a voice, cold as stone, rolled down the tunnel. Where you running off to, Miller? David knew that voice. One of Victor's men. The group shrank back, panic flashing in their eyes. Anna's fingers clamped onto his sleeve, clutching like she was holding onto life itself. David shifted, pushing her behind him, his body a shield. He drew the pistol, his arm steady, though every nerve screamed that they were trapped. Then came another sound, the shuffle of boots scraping stone behind them. David turned his head just enough to see another beam of light, this one closing off the way back. They were pinned, hunted from both ends, animals caught in a steel trap. The air turned sour, thick with the mix of mildew, sweat, and gunpowder. It was the same taste he'd had on his tongue in war zones, moments before the killing began. The young immigrant, his face pale as ash, whispered through broken English, "What? What do we do?" David's jaw clenched so tight it ached. His voice came out gravel deep, steady. "We fight, or we die here." Anna pressed her face against his back, trembling, but her whisper reached him clear. "I won't leave you, Dad." It struck him like a torch in the dark. For all the years, for all the scars, this was the one thing he couldn't lose. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about holding on to family, to faith, to something worth dying for. The tunnel tightened around them, silence heavy as a coffin lid. Then the glare from up front shifted, sweeping across the bricks, and in that sharp white light Victor appeared. He stood just behind his man, calm as a king in his court, that crooked smile etched deep. "I told you, Miller," his voice carried, thick with smugness. "You can't win." The words clawed through the damp air, and before David could even reply, thunder ripped the tunnel. The first gunshot cracked like the sky itself breaking, fire spitting in the black, and the night swallowed everything in its roar. The first shot cracked through the tunnel like thunder splitting stone, and the air itself seemed to break apart under the blast. Dust rose from the old bricks, drifting like smoke in the thin light. David threw his arm around Anna, pressing her against the damp wall, his other hand shoving the three immigrants down low against the dirt. White beams from flashlights slashed across the tunnel from both ends, sweeping back and forth, lighting the haze like battlefield flares. And in that light, David saw it clear badges flashing under uniforms. These weren't just Victor's thugs. There were police here too. Sheriff Cole had stepped into it. This wasn't just an ambush in the dark. It was a sanctioned trap, dressed up in law, built to crush him quiet. Cole's voice carried down the stone, low and cold, heavy with authority. "David, bring them out. This is your last chance. If you don't, you'll drag your own daughter to the grave with you." Each word hit David's skull like a hammer strike. He pulled Anna tight to his chest, felt her body trembling so hard it rattled through his bones. "Dad, I'm scared," she whispered, her voice breaking. David pressed his forehead to her damp hair, his lips brushing against it as he whispered back, "I'm here. I won't let anyone lay a hand on you." It was more than comfort for his daughter. It was a vow, carved deep inside him. Up ahead, the lights flared brighter, figures taking shape. A row of police blocked the way, weapons raised, muzzles gleaming. The sharp, metallic clicks of bolts and slides racked back echoed in unison, a sound like a countdown to the end. David lifted his old pistol, his body wide in front of the group. He knew the truth chances of walking out alive were thin to none, but to step back meant handing Anna over. And that was something he'd rather die than do. Behind him, the woman clutched her baby, muffling its cries against her chest, her own sobs breaking through. The young man shook, twitching like he wanted to lunge forward, but David's arm shot out, his voice hard and commanding, "No, stay low, stay close." His breathing came rough, but his eyes burned, sharp and fierce. In that heartbeat, the war came back, the nights huddled in bunkers, bombs thundering overhead, comrades falling one by one, and him dragging the survivors through the smoke. But this time it wasn't soldiers at his back. It was his little girl. David's voice boomed through the tunnel, raw and desperate. "Cole, you can kill me, but this child has nothing to do with it. Let Anna go." For a moment, silence. Then a flicker of hesitation. Some of the flashlights dipped, the barrels lowering just a little. In that tiny slip, there was still something human in the men behind those badges. But it didn't last. Victor's voice slithered from the shadows behind them, sharp as a knife. "No exceptions, Miller. Everyone in this darkness is guilty." His laugh ricocheted off the bricks, thin and cruel, slicing into the silence. And right then David understood it wasn't just about the immigrants, not about the law. Victor wanted him gone, erased. He wanted Anna destroyed along with him, the final nail to bury David as a traitor. The air pressed in, suffocating. The damp stank of stone mixed with sweat and fear. David tightened his grip on the gun, his muscles braced for the collapse that was coming. He was ready for it, ready to burn everything he had left in one last stand. Then the tunnel itself shifted. A brick overhead cracked and fell, shattering on the ground. Dust burst into the light, and from the side, from a slit of shadow in the wall, came a sound and echo of movement, a scrape against stone. Someone else was here. Someone slipping through a passage he hadn't even known existed. David's eyes snapped toward it, heart pounding. The others froze, caught between terror and hope. The tunnel was no longer just a cage. It had cracks. and through one of those cracks, something unexpected was coming. The tunnel had always been a place that smelled of damp stone and old earth, but that night it felt alive, like it had a pulse of its own. The echo of falling dust still rumbled from the ceiling where a loose brick had given way. The air was clogged, thick with grit, and each grain that drifted down caught in the beams of the flashlights, turning the darkness into a storm of pale sparks. Then came the sound of boots shuffling forward, steel clicking against steel, the unmistakable rhythm of men ready to end something. David pressed Anna back against the cold brick wall, his arm curved around her like a shield. Behind them, the three migrants huddled low, their faces ghostly under the darting light. Every breath in that tunnel carried the taste of rust and old fear. David could feel his own chest pounding, as if his heart wanted to kick its way out. He'd been under fire in deserts half a world away. But this was different. This was home soil, and standing in front of him was not an enemy in foreign colors, but men wearing the same badge that once was supposed to mean safety. From the far end, Victor walked out of the glare, his stride smooth, almost theatrical. He wore that dark coat of his, and the beam from the flashlights cut him into a silhouette. His smile, half smug, half certain, didn't break as he spoke. "It's over, Miller. You've got no way out. Hand them over, and maybe you and your girl keep breathing a little longer." The words slithered through the air, steady, confident, like a man who already believed the story had been written. David felt Anna trembling against his ribs. He turned his head, ready to whisper back reassurance, ready to stand his ground again. But then, before he could move, Anna slipped free. His hand snatched at empty air. She stepped out from behind him, that small figure swallowed by the harsh circle of light. Her hair was damp with sweat, cheeks streaked where tears had been, but her chin lifted. Her voice was thin at first, catching against her throat, but then it cut sharper than any bullet. "If you're going to kill them, kill me first." The tunnel froze. Even the dripping water from the ceiling seemed to pause. Every man there, Victor, the deputies, the migrants, even David, stared at that child planted in the center of the light. She looked like a reed in a storm, fragile and bending, but she refused to break. David's lungs emptied. It felt like someone had torn out the years of combat, the armor he carried inside, and left him bare. He'd seen villagers stare down armored vehicles, with nothing but desperation in their eyes. He'd watched young soldiers throw themselves into fire so their unit could crawl out alive. But never had he imagined his own daughter, his Anna, would stand in the same line between mercy and violence. Sheriff Cole's face flickered. His hands, knuckles white on his pistol, eased a little, the barrel dipping. In his eyes, for the briefest second, there was something that didn't fit the cold mask he always wore. Doubt, maybe guilt. But Victor's laugh snapped through the tunnel like barbed wire. It rolled over them, bouncing off the walls, mean and sharp. "Childish games," Victor called out. "Even the girl knows my law. Anyone who resists gets erased, even her." He lifted a hand, casual as if he were ordering another drink at the bar, and his men tightened their fingers on their triggers. The metallic clicks cascaded, like dominoes falling, one after another. David's body wanted to move, to throw himself in front of her, but his boots felt nailed to the floor. He could hear the soft prayers of the woman clutching her child behind him, the rasping breath of the young man who was barely more than a boy himself. But all he saw was Anna, her arms spreading wide, her shoulders squared, though they trembled. "No one touches her." David's roar cracked the tunnel, his throat shredding with the sound. "If you want blood, take mine." And Anna shook her head, tears streaking down, her voice somehow louder than his. "You can't carry it all, Dad. I'm your blood too. If you protect them, then I protect you." It was like hearing a vow spoken by someone twice her age. David staggered back a step, stunned. The courage in her words broke something inside him and filled it all at once. His little girl wasn't hiding anymore. She was standing beside him, not behind. The deputies shifted, their lights jittering on the walls. You could feel the tension about to snap, like the tunnel itself was holding its breath. Sheriff Cole's lips parted. He seemed ready to speak, to call them back, but no words came. His jaw worked as if grinding between loyalty and conscience. And then another voice split the air. A woman's voice, rough, scarred by hardship, but carrying steel. "Stop. If you fire, the truth comes out right now." From the side passage, where the dust still hung in a cloud, a shadow formed. Thin shoulders, hair tangled, eyes burning with something both desperate and unbreakable. Maria. David's mind jolted. He remembered glimpsing her once through a crack in the door, a face he thought belonged to just another shadow of suffering. But now she was here, stepping out, not hiding. Her words echoed with more than defiance. They carried evidence, secrets, the kind of thing Victor couldn't afford to spill into daylight. The tunnel trembled with silence after her declaration. Anna still stood tall in the beam, her body quivering but unyielding. David felt the moment like a knife edge, knowing any second could decide whether bullets would tear through flesh or whether truth, fragile but sharp, might force the guns to lower. And in that breathless pause, he realized his daughter had done what war never taught him. She had turned fear into a weapon stronger than violence. The second Maria's voice cut through the tunnel, the fragile balance collapsed into chaos. For a heartbeat, some of the deputies had lowered their weapons, caught in the sting of conscience. But Victor's roar ripped that hesitation to shreds. "Fire on them!" he barked, his voice echoing off stone, brutal and commanding. David didn't think he moved. Years of instinct buried deep in muscle memory surged alive. He hurled himself at the nearest man, his shoulder slamming into the deputy's chest. The rifle flew loose, clattering across the wet bricks, its metal scraping sparks in the dark. The sound ricocheted down the tunnel like a flare shot into the night. Yells rose up all around them, the beam of flashlights spinning wild, blinding, painting the moss-coated walls with jagged bursts of light and shadow. Behind him, Anna cried out, her thin voice breaking, but Maria yanked her back, shielding the girl with wiry arms, her eyes locked on David with a desperate prayer. David drove his elbow hard into another man's jaw, felt the bone crack beneath skin and muscle. He didn't stop. Rage that had been simmering for months, maybe years, poured out of him in each blow. Water sloshed around their ankles, splattering high with every collapse of a body. The tunnel roared like a living thing, the splash and grunt of violence mingling with the drip of ancient water. A third man lunged, catching David by the shoulder. They went down hard, bodies thrashing in the shallow flood, but David rolled with it, dragging him under, pinning him against the bricks. His breath tore in and out of him, hot and raw. Then another weight crashed from the darkness. He didn't need to see the face to know. Victor, his suit soaked, tie dangling like a noose, eyes burning with fury that felt older than this fight. They slammed into each other, the force rattling teeth, their bodies swallowed by the cold filth at the tunnel floor. Water splashed up around them, icy against their burning skin. Victor's hand flashed. A blade, short and mean, caught a shard of flashlight glare. David caught his wrist, their arms trembling inches from his chest. Their faces pressed so close he could feel Victor's spit when he hissed through his teeth. "You're nothing but a washed-up soldier. You don't get to defy me." "Dot!" David roared back, his throat tearing. He heaved, twisting his body, sending Victor rolling. The blade carved across his side, hot pain searing through flesh, his coat tearing open. Warm blood seeped down into the freezing water. Victor scrambled up, teeth bared, lunging again. The knife came straight for his chest. David caught it with his forearm, steel biting into skin, blood spilling in a red ribbon. He ignored the pain, clamped down on Victor's wrist, and slammed him backward. The sound of bone and brick colliding thundered, water exploding outward, droplets glittering like shards of glass in the frantic light. Behind them, the others huddled back against the wall, silent but wide-eyed, as if the fight were something out of nightmare. Anna's voice broke through it all, raw and piercing. "Dad!" she screamed, her sob echoing like a knife against his ribs. He couldn't look back. Not now. Seconds stretched long as years. Each breath was war, each heartbeat a verdict. Kill or be killed. There was no middle ground left. David slammed his forearm across Victor's throat, forcing him under. The knife slipped, clanging onto the bricks. Victor thrashed, fists striking, nails clawing, water foaming around them. David's own growl rose, primal, animal, as he held the man down, his muscles burning with effort and hate. But then Victor's lips twisted into a bloody grin, even with water bubbling at the corners. His voice rasped out, mocking, taunting. "You don't even know the truth, Miller. That woman, Maria, she isn't just some ghost from your past. She's the key, the reason you lost everything." The words hit harder than the blade ever could. David's grip faltered, just enough for doubt to bleed in. His hand trembled at Victor's throat, his pulse slammed against his skull. He turned his head, and there she was, Maria, half hidden in the flicker of the flashlights, her face lined, her eyes bright with tears that refused to fall. She didn't speak, didn't plead. She only looked at him, as if daring him to confront what he'd buried all these years. David's chest heaved. The fight wasn't just blood and fists anymore. It was the truth clawing its way up through the mud of his life, demanding to be seen. He realized then this wasn't about survival alone. This was reckoning. And then it happened. From behind, a gun cracked. The blast was deafening in the tunnel, a cannon shot trapped in stone. The bullet slammed into the wall inches above Anna's head, sending shards of brick raining down around her. She screamed, throwing her arms over her face. David's heart stopped cold, the roar of violence around him dimming to a single thought. He was about to lose her. And just like that, the war inside him tipped into something beyond fury. The gunfire faded into silence, leaving the tunnel heavy and suffocating, as if the air itself had turned to stone. The smell of gunpowder mixed with damp rot, settling deep into the chest like a weight no man could carry with ease. Victor lay sprawled on the flooded ground, breath ragged, blood spreading in dark clouds around him. Even at the edge of death, his eyes still gleamed with that same defiance, the smirk of a man who believed control belonged to him until the very last second. Sheriff Cole stood frozen, pistol trembling in his hand, face pale with the shock of a man who finally realized he had crossed a line there was no coming back from. David stood drenched, his body slick with his own blood and the filth of the tunnel. In his arms, pressed tight to his chest, was Anna. The girl's face was streaked with dust and tears, her small frame shaking with the aftershock of terror, but her hands clung to her father's shirt with a grip that refused to let go. Around them, the fallen flashlights flickered in and out, painting the walls in stuttering strokes of pale light, and in that shifting glow, David saw her. Maria. Her hair hung loose and tangled, her face thin, hollowed by years of running, but her eyes, those eyes burned with a pain so familiar that David's chest clenched until he could barely breathe. His voice broke when he said her name, soft as a prayer he had sworn never to speak again. Maria. For years he had buried her memory like a body lowered into the ground. He had told himself she was gone, stolen by war, that the woman he once loved had been consumed by violence the way so many others had. Yet there she stood, flesh and bone, rising out of the darkness of this ruined place. Maria nodded once, lips trembling but silent. The baby in the arms of the immigrant woman whimpered, that fragile sound cutting through the fog of disbelief, snapping everyone back to the cruel reality of the present. Anna looked from her father to Maria, her eyes wide, unblinking, confusion and shock etched into her young face. "Dad, is that?" She could not finish the question. David pulled her tighter, as though holding her closer could shield her from the storm of truth about to fall. Maria took a step forward, each movement deliberate, her gaze locked on David's. And then, finally, she spoke, her voice cracked and raw, rasping like wind forcing itself through broken stone. "I didn't die. I was forced to disappear. These years. I have lived running, always hunted, never safe." Her words fell heavy, a chill creeping deeper into the damp air of the tunnel. David felt his chest tighten, as though his ribs were being crushed inward. Memories of Anna sneaking food to the old abandoned house, nights when she thought her father slept, those images lit up inside him now, cruelly clear. His little girl had been feeding her own mother all along. The woman he believed was only a ghost in memory had been alive, hiding in the shadows of the same town. Truth cut sharper than any blade. It was raw, unbearable, and it bled through every part of him. He pressed Anna closer, desperate to hold on to the only certainty left to him. His voice came out broken, trembling. "Why?" Maria did not answer right away. Her eyes drifted to Victor, lying in his own blood. The faint, dying smile on his lips said more than any confession could. In that grin, David understood this went beyond betrayal, beyond personal hatred. There was a deeper wound, a hidden story, and Victor had carried it with him all the way to his grave. Sheriff Cole turned away, his shoulders sagging under the weight of what he had done. His silence was thick, an unspoken acknowledgement that the game he thought he could control had slipped from his hands. But David no longer cared about Cole. He heard only Anna's shaky breaths and the relentless pounding of his own heart. Maria stepped closer. Determination lit her eyes now, piercing through the years of fear that had shaped her face. "You don't know everything, David," she said, her voice steadier now, words ringing through the hollow chamber. "This is only the beginning. There is more, and they will not stop until everything is buried, until none of us remain." The words hung in the air like the last toll of a bell. In the darkness, wind seeped through the cracks of the tunnel, whispering like restless voices from the past that refused to stay buried. David's hand tightened on the old pistol, his knuckles white. Tonight, he understood, peace had finally been stripped from him for good. Whatever comfort he thought he might claw back was gone. And then, as he lifted his eyes toward the far mouth of the tunnel, he saw it, the faint glow of light spilling inward. Shadows stretched long on the walls, not just one but many, moving toward them. Figures, silent, purposeful, stepping out of the unknown, carrying with them the promise that the night was far from over. David's story brings out a simple yet cutting truth. Silence in the face of injustice is itself a way of helping evil. No matter our age, we still have to choose, stand with the truth, or be swallowed by lies. A father determined to keep his child close and protect the vulnerable shows that sometimes Personal resolve is the last anchor left. What remains for each of us is the question: when the darkness closes in, will we turn away, or will we stand our ground? Are you watching this video in the morning or at night? Let me know down in the comments. And if you'd like to keep hearing more heartfelt stories about soldiers coming home, don't forget to subscribe to the Soldiers Coming Home channel and be part of the journey with us.